So we come to this passage here in John chapter 18, and this is I'm going to say it's a fairly well-known passage as far as what is taking place here. It's contained in some of the other gospel accounts, and actually we're going to be referencing Luke's account. There's a little bit more specificity in that we're going to focus on. But this is the story of Peter denying Jesus. Openly and even we find in another account that he even swears to this, that he is actually cursing when he is confronted with the reality that, hey, I know you were with this Jesus. And he denies it, and we're going to look at how this account, let me say it this way, it's so easy to look at things, look at some of the biblical accounts, and even other things in history, and it's easy for us to put ourselves in the shoes of the heroes of stories, but it's kind of hard for us to face the reality that, maybe we could have also been in other roles, and putting ourselves in, letting ourselves realize the fact that, maybe I'm just as capable of doing terrible things as other people are. And that's a hard thing to come to realize. The title for the sermon today is called Ordinary Men, and I picked that because it was actually a title of a book. It was a book written by an author named Christopher Browning, and it was a detailed account in this book of a reserve police battalion in Poland during the Nazi occupation. And it gives the really horrific details of how this really normal group of guys in many ways went through the motions of some terrible atrocities for a long time. And one of the incredible things about that whole story and why it's called Ordinary Men is because these men in this group, yes, they were manipulated into what they were doing, but at the same time, they were free to go. I don't know if you know that, but when the Nazi occupation took place in Poland, they used a lot of the local law enforcement to kind of help round up Jews and kind of do their bidding. And one of the fascinating things about that was, even though at times the Nazis, of course, were very heavy-handed and brutal, but in this account, in dealing with this police battalion, they gave them the option whether they wanted to continue to do this job or not. And what they found was most of them stayed on. And it was kind of a look at this mentality of, this is a bad job, it's kind of terrible what we're being asked to do. But there was this sort of like camaraderie of, I don't want to leave my buddies to have to do this. And so in a very twisted kind of way, these rather ordinary men then carried out some really horrific atrocities. And I thought it fitting because the fact that when we look at a story like the story of Peter, for example, it's really easy to kind of pass judgment on him and say, how could he do that? It's hard to look in the mirror and say, I can't promise that I would have done better. And that's a hard realization. And we, of course, now, we have the benefit of looking back through history, knowing that the death of Jesus is not the end. That he actually is resurrected 3 days later. But for Peter, at this moment, this is it. This is it. And we looked in previous weeks at Peter's response when the soldiers and the men came to arrest Jesus. And just by way of a brief recap, there was a significant amount of armed men who came to arrest Jesus, which I find to be very fascinating. Whenever you put that against the normal concepts that we have about Jesus, that he was this, I'm going to say, if you look at a lot of the pictures of Jesus, kind of very effeminate, and he is sort of going around and spitting out pithy little sayings and giving marshmallows to people. He wasn't doing that, of course, but it's just this concept that we have of Jesus that's very softened, I think. If that's the case, why did they send a detachment, and the word specifically is in reference to, we're talking about between 200 and 600 armed men to come arrest Jesus? Why do you need that many if he's just some harmless rabbi? Of course, they were worried about an uprising. They were worried about people defending him. And Peter was one who defended him. He drew his sword and he went after Malchus. And as we talked about, he ended up cutting off his ear. He didn't try to cut off his ear. He tried to cut off his head. But he missed. He only got a little part of him. And Jesus then miraculously heals this man who was there to arrest him. He puts his ear back on, which, and I mentioned this, yes, that was tremendously gracious to that man, but he was also removing any kind of physical evidence that would have been against Peter too, which is interesting to think about. But in this account, we see that Peter has really kind of given up in a lot of ways. I don't think he has absolutely given up. We're going to see that later. But his whole world is crashing down. And this Jesus, who he believed to be the Messiah, is now going through something that there's no way that God, if he is his chosen one, there's no way that God could let this happen to him. And that's how Peter is reasoning here. And so we're going to read the account of Peter and his denial. But I want to, before we do that, I want to take a look at a passage where Jesus himself predicts this denial. And that is in Luke chapter 22. So if you want to turn to Luke 22. And we're going to spend actually quite a bit of time in Luke's gospel today as we look at the details around Peter and his denial of Jesus. But as we do, again, I want to challenge you to see yourself in this a bit. And this was something that, as I was reading through this, again, refusing to let myself take the position that I wouldn't have done that, and trying to think of myself as if I would have done better. And again, I think it's important for us to realize that Peter, even Peter, who, and we're going to see him come full circle at the end of this, but something as horrible as this was not off the table for Peter. So let's pick it up here. Luke 22, I'm going to start in verse 24. It says, "And there arose also a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be the greatest. And he said to them, The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But it is not this way with you. But the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. For who is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and just as my Father has granted me a kingdom, I grant you that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. And you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel." I'm going to pause right there for a moment. So Jesus is answering a dispute that is taking place. And the dispute was essentially going along the lines of, hey, when you become king, who's going to be your right hand and left hand guys? Who's going to have this position of honor next to you? And so they were, the disciples, now it doesn't say specifically Peter was in this argument. He may have been. I kind of think that he probably was, because Jesus calls him out specifically here in a moment. But they're arguing as to who's going to be the greatest in this kingdom. Who's going to have this position of favor next to Jesus. And Jesus is trying to get something across to them, something that he's been trying to teach them for a while. As I'm reading through this, I'm reminded of the account of Jesus washing the disciples' feet not too long before this. And again, when we looked at that passage, we explored how absolutely beneath Jesus this was for him to do. He being the rabbi, being the master, this would have been terribly uncomfortable for the disciples. The reason for that was you wouldn't, in that culture, you wouldn't even ask a fellow Jew to do this for you. You would have, if you had a servant in the household, it would have been probably a Gentile who is washing the feet of your guests coming in. And here, Jesus kneels down and he starts washing the disciples' feet, and it made them super uncomfortable. He's serving them. He is serving them, and he's trying to convey to them, this is what leadership in the kingdom looks like. It's service. It's not like the Gentiles who just lord it over people. It is actually, if you are in charge of somebody, if you have a group of people who are under you, then your job is one of service to them, not to demand this and that of them. And so here, Jesus specifically then calls out Simon. And if you notice here, in this next verse, he says, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." Now I want to note a couple of things here. First of all, Jesus uses the double emphatic. So in the language there is no exclamation point, as we would say, or there's really no way of showing emotion other than repetition, and that's what they would do. There's only a few places in Scripture where a name is repeated. We see the repetition, this emphasis elsewhere. Jesus uses it a lot, actually, in reference to truth. He would say, "Truly, truly, I say to you," or "Verily, verily," which he says, I think 70 some times just in the Gospel of John alone. He says it a lot. But here, he's actually using a name, Simon, Simon. And there's only about a dozen places in Scripture where the double emphatic is used with a name. But it always carries with it an intense emotion and concern. The one that came to mind was when David realized that his son Absalom was dead, one who he had pled with God for, and he cries out, "Absalom, Absalom." This emphasis. And here Jesus is crying out to Peter, and what he says here is, "Behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and you, when once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." Now, this is incredible because what Jesus is saying here specifically to Peter is that Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. What comes to mind here is the account of Job. So if you remember the story of Job opens with this very strange encounter where Satan comes and presents himself before God, and it says also with the sons of God, which is referencing the angelic host. Satan comes and presents himself, and the conversation between God and Satan begins to be centered around this man, Job. And Satan has a theory about Job, and his theory is the only reason he loves you and serves you is because you have blessed him, because you have protected him, and because you've given him all these things. And so Satan's theory on Job was, get rid of all that stuff and he will curse you to your face. That's what Satan thinks about Job. And the incredible thing is, God allows, with restrictions, with boundaries, but he allows Satan to test his theory on Job. That's pretty wild. He puts boundaries on him. This is how far you can go, no further. But he permits it. Now, one of the things throughout the story of Job that's fascinating, that account that it begins with, Job is never privy to that information. There's nowhere we find out that God pulls him aside and says, hey, I've got a bet riding on you, just hang on there, right? I'll bless you more at the end. He never does anything like that. He lets Satan, for the most part, have his way with him to test his theory on Job. And here, this is incredible because Satan apparently has targeted specifically Peter. And what is Jesus could have snapped his fingers and stopped Satan from going ahead with this. But what he does say is, I have prayed for you. I have prayed for you. Now, let's be honest, we use this kind of cheaply today. Right? Someone shares their heart with you, I'll pray for you. And maybe it's real. Maybe you will. But sometimes it seems like, that's it, Jesus? Like, this is all you're doing? Just a prayer, maybe? Maybe you could just kind of keep Satan at bay. But he doesn't. He says, I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. Jesus prayed that Peter's faith in this trial would not fail. And I'm going to throw this question out to you. Was Jesus' prayer answered? Did Peter's faith fail? And that's just something to think about. Did his faith fail? And then he says, Satan demands permission to sift you like wheat. And this imagery kind of escapes us a little bit. Back then, when they had to separate the chaff from the wheat, there was basically two ways they would do it. One way was, since chaff is a lot lighter than wheat, and like the wheat kernels, the wheat berries, they would take some of it and they would throw it up in the air, both the chaff and the wheat together. And a little breeze would carry away the chaff and the wheat would fall back down. So do that a bunch of times, and that was a way to kind of clear and separate out the wheat from the chaff. But they would also use sifting. And so because the wheat barriers were denser than the chaff, there was a way to sift it and you could separate it out. But make no mistake, if you're ever to watch someone do this, it's a pretty violent process of separating this out. I mean, it was hard work to do that. And so this is the analogy that Jesus is giving here. This is what Satan wants to do with you, Peter. And then he goes on here. But he said to him, Lord, with you I am ready to go both to prison and to death. And he said, I say to you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you have denied me 3 times that you know me. Now, Jesus here, of course, is speaking prophetically. He knows exactly what's going to happen. He knows exactly what's going to happen. Now, imagine here now, you're Jesus, and this guy is telling you how devoted he is to you, but you know that it lacks substance. You know that when it's tried, that he's going to fail. And not only that, it's going to happen pretty quickly. It's going to happen before the next morning. This would have been, had to have been very devastating for Peter to hear. But it didn't change the reality and the fact that this is what actually happened. Let's skip down in Luke's gospel to same chapter 22, verse 54. And we're going to find this account of him doing this very thing. Having arrested him, they led him away and brought him to the house of the high priest. But Peter was following at a distance. And I suppose that phrase right there, following at a distance, and you could, there's a sermon in that all its own, I imagine. After they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard, he had sat down together. Peter was sitting among them, and a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the firelight and looking intently at him, said, "This man was with him too." Now, interestingly, why does it specifically note that it was a servant girl? Well, I don't know, probably because that's the way it happened. But imagine you're being accused by probably the least threatening person. A servant girl is saying, hey, this guy was with him too. And he denied it, saying, woman, I do not know him. A little later, another saw him and said, you are one of them too. But Peter said, I am not. After about an hour had passed, another man began to insist, saying, certainly this man also was with him, for he is a Galilean too. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you are talking about. And immediately, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. So if you can imagine this scene, Peter is there, and they're bringing in Jesus in the middle of the night, in the early morning hours, before the high priest, and he is there. He's close enough to kind of see and hear what's happening, but he's also then being accused of being one of his followers, one of his close few. And then the third time that he denies him, it says that the Lord turned and looked at Peter. So apparently they were within eyeshot of each other. And can you imagine, perhaps even Jesus heard him saying this, even though he knew it was going to happen. He knew he was going to do it. And he turned and looked at him. And that just broke Peter. Peter then remembered the word of the Lord, how he told him, before a rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. If you take a moment and consider, if you were to compare Judas and Peter on this night, they don't look too different. They really don't. Judas, of course, was very upset. We ultimately know the choices that he made. He went and he threw the silver back to the priests and to the Pharisees, and then he went out and he hung himself. He ended his own life. Peter, thanks be to God, didn't do that. He didn't end his own life. He wept bitterly. He wept bitterly. And when you consider that, this difference that maybe wasn't so big, because I bet Peter was pretty close. I don't know. It doesn't say. But this had to be absolutely crushing for him. And we look at this and say, well, I've never done anything that bad. I've never denied Jesus, and is that real? Because when we ask the question, because what's going on here is, in the face of potentially being connected with Jesus at this moment, Peter says and does things. He has nothing to do with him. He distances himself, and he even, in another gospel account, he even curses. And I'm not going to stand up here and say that we've all done this. But be honest with yourself. Have we ever acted ashamed of Jesus? Have we ever been in a situation where maybe we thought we should say something and we didn't? Or maybe we said something even that was not reflective of what we think and believe about Jesus? And just imagining, maybe we can relate with Peter a little bit more than we would like to think. And I'm going to put to you that is, although that's not a good thing, Jesus is in the business of redeeming and bringing good out of horrible things. And so here, he wept bitterly. The last passage we're going to look at here is Peter's reinstatement, because we know that this isn't the end of the story. And if you can imagine, try to get inside of Peter's head a little bit. He denies him, he has nothing to do with him, and he is convicted of that. He weeps bitterly, and then Jesus is hauled off and he is executed, tortured and executed. And that is, in Peter's mind, this is the end of Jesus. It's the end of this movement. And what does Peter do? Let's turn to John chapter 21. Now, of course, in a little while, we're going to get to this passage as we go through John, but I think it's crucial that we take a look at this now, at this moment. John 21, and we'll pick it up in the beginning, the first verse. After these things, now again, this is after the crucifixion, burial, 3 days, and the resurrection. But the disciples here don't know about it yet. And these things Jesus manifests himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And he manifested himself in this way. Simon Peter and Thomas, called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and the 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." Peter goes right back to his life pre-Jesus. This is all he knows. Right? I'm sure he enjoyed it, but this is also his livelihood. What else is he going to do? What else is he going to do? He goes fishing. And they said to him, "We will also come with you." They went out and got into a boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach, and yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus said to them, "Children, you do not have any fish, do you?" And they answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will find a catch." So they cast, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." Now, why does he come to this conclusion? Well, because if we recall, this isn't the first time Jesus has done this with them. He does it again. So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and he threw himself into the sea. So, as an aside, they didn't have really fancy boats where you could get in the cabin with air conditioning or anything like that. So it got really hot, and oftentimes, even overnight, sometimes if it was pretty hot, you would kind of strip down, and you weren't wearing a whole lot when you were out there working and fishing. And when we say fishing back then, it wasn't just, it wasn't this. They're moving nets and all kinds of stuff, untangling them, throwing them out again. So it was a lot more work. So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and he threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. So when they got out on the land, they saw charcoal fire already laid and fish on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have caught." Simon Peter went up and drew the net to the land full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples ventured to question him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. Now, I'm going to pause here for a moment. Take a look at how ordinary this encounter is. This is incredible. Jesus doesn't show up on the beach and start setting off fireworks. "Hey guys, I'm back." This is just a very relaxed, kind of been there, done that before, and he welcomes his friends in to eat with him. And this is something else. Why does Jesus eat with his disciples? That seems kind of strange. This is post-resurrection. There have been people that have offered theories on the resurrection of Jesus, trying to explain it away. And some people will say, "Oh, they thought they saw a ghost." Okay, ghosts don't eat fish. This is a very sort of physical, normal encounter that he is having with his disciples at this moment. an encounter that they've had in a similar fashion probably a lot of times before. And this is now the third time that Jesus was manifest to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, the "these" is assumably reference to the fish, meaning, do you love me more than fish or more than fishing? And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my lambs." And he said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Shepherd my sheep." And he said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk where you wished. But when you are old and grown, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go." Now this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God with. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Peter, turning around, saw the disciples whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "Lord, and what about this man?" And Jesus said to him, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." This is magnificent. This is the reinstatement and the, you could say, the forgiveness of Peter. And Peter is troubled because Jesus asks him 3 times if he loved him. And of course, that's because Peter denied him 3 times. Something else that, and some scholars bring this out, the usage of love here, so there's some different words for love in the Greek language. There's actually like 5 of them. And we, in English, unfortunately only have 1 word. So we say we love pizza, and we say we love, our spouses, our children. This is different kind of love, right? But Jesus, apparently the words that he uses initially is, "Do you agape me?" which is a very selfless, godlike love. And Peter's response is, "Yes, I phileo you," which is a brotherly love. And then they go through this twice, and then on the last one, Jesus says, "Do you phileo me?" And then his response is, "Yes, I agape you." Some people make a big deal on that, and maybe so. Maybe we don't catch the weight of it exactly here in English. But the fact is, Jesus, he doesn't say, here's the penance you need to perform. Here's the boxes you have to check. He doesn't say, well, let's just see how you do and let's see if I can forgive you or not. He welcomes him back in and he forgives him. And then he gives this account depicting the way that Peter is going to die. And I wanted to close with this thought because Peter was so terrified. He said that he would go to jail and to the grave with Jesus, but he was afraid to. Something happened in Peter. Some change took place because after this, he becomes such a bold, fearless preacher of the gospel. And we know that from church history, he actually does die for Jesus in the way that Jesus states here. It says that when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went wherever you wish, but when you were older, someone will lead you where you don't want to go. And it was in reference to his death. Peter, as church history tells us, was crucified, but his last wish was that he would be crucified upside down. In his words, he said he wasn't worthy to be killed in the same manner as his Savior. So he was crucified upside down. How does a man go from being terrified on the night Jesus is arrested to becoming bold as a lion at the end of his life? And the answer is resurrection. It's because he encountered the risen Jesus. And finally, he realized that Jesus had to do this. He had to go through the cross. And he was physically, literally resurrected from the grave. And because of that, nothing could stop him, and nothing could stop this movement of Christianity. Nothing. And this completely took away the fear that Peter had going into that night. And he is fully restored and forgiven and brought in. And we know Peter now in church history as just a magnificent pillar and faithful to the end. And I want to put to you this. How often do we let guilt and failure take a hold of us and cripple us, and we never come full circle, and we never we might say, yeah, I know God forgives me, but we never actually forgive ourselves. And that's a real thing. It can be paralyzing. And I would suggest to you that if God has forgiven you, who are you to consider yourself not forgiven? Right? Paul tells us in Romans, who can lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God who justifies. So sometimes accepting the forgiveness of Jesus, sometimes making the decision of weeping bitterly instead of making decisions that will prevent God from forgiving us, like Judas did. Being allowed back in and accepting this kind of love and forgiveness, and through that, making an immeasurable difference. Shepherding sheep, as Jesus told him that he would do, and leading many, and propagating the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so anyone, no matter what you've done, can come and be forgiven. And Peter was a living example of this in his life and then ultimately in his death. And this is the love and grace that we have from our Father. Let's go ahead and close in prayer this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, God, we thank you for this account, for this story. We thank you for Peter, and I thank you that this is even included in the Scriptures, that we might know that those who you chose to follow you were far from perfect. And that brings us tremendous comfort because we are far from perfect, and we fail, and we at times are ashamed of you. God, I ask that you would, through the assurance of your resurrection, make us unashamed of your gospel and your grace, and that we may shepherd many and spread this gospel to all who will hear it, and this message of love and forgiveness that you offer. And these things I pray in the precious name of Jesus the Christ. Amen.